walk like an Egyptian.
Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be discussing ancient Egypt, the second of the major river valley civilizations that we are going to be examining from period 1. So the first river valley civilization we studied was Mesopotamia on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today we're going to be heading southwest down to the Nile River in ancient Egypt. Now, when we talk about river valley civilizations, why do we oftentimes think about ancient Egypt? And I think there's really two good reasons why we think about ancient Egypt. First, the Egyptians left really cool stuff. And this wasn't true of other ancient civilizations. So according to historical texts, there are 7 ancient wonders of the world, and the only one that's still around, the Great Pyramids at Giza. So the Egyptians left cool stuff. A second reason that we oftentimes think about ancient Egypt when we think about the ancient world is they were around for a really long time. Ancient Egypt really marks its beginnings around 3000 BCE and concludes around 300 BCE. And we can compare that, so that's thousands of years of a historical record. And we compare that to the United States, which has just been around almost 250 years. So they lasted a really long time. So the big questions we need to be able to answer after watching this video are: 1, how are the ancient Egyptians influenced by their environment? 2, how did the ruler of ancient Egypt maintain political authority? And 3, how were ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia similar socially, economically, and culturally? And in what ways were they different? So in answering that first question, how are the ancient Egyptians influenced by their environment? We first have to understand Egyptian geography. So ancient Egypt was located on the banks of the Nile River in northeast Africa, which for purposes of this class, AP World History, is located in the region of the Middle East. So we see the Nile River, which flows from south to north, and that's based upon the elevation. The Nile River is surrounded by a Sahara Desert, which offered ancient Egypt a lot of geographic protection. Cities started to form on the banks of the Nile River, like Cairo, Thebes, Memphis. And that's why still today the vast majority of Egyptians live within a mile on either side of the Nile River. We can see this from some photographs of Egypt at night. So the Nile River floods regularly every year, depositing silt and soil on its banks, which made it excellent for growing crops on the banks of the river. So is this a similarity or difference to Mesopotamia? Think about that for a second. So the fact that it's geographically protected might make this a difference, as ancient Mesopotamia was very much a crossroads for different civilizations moving through that region because there was no geographic barriers. And the Nile River, the fact that it floods regularly every year as opposed to the Tigris and Euphrates, which flooded irregularly, makes it a difference. And so be aware of those differences because they're going to come back later on in the lecture. Now, the second big question we need to be able to answer is: how did the ruler of ancient Egypt maintain political authority? So ancient Egypt was ruled by a series of rulers known as pharaohs. The pharaoh was believed to be a god living in human form on earth. Now, we could tell stories about individual pharaohs for hours, and I just want to mention one really quickly, and that involves the pharaoh King Tut, or King Tutankhamun was his full name. Now, King Tut died when he was only 19 years old. He didn't have any major accomplishments during his lifetime. Here are some other images of King Tut. Now, what do you find interesting? Anything stand out to you about these images? Now, one of the things that you may have noticed is that King Tut was holding on to this walking stick. Now, the reason King Tut had to use a walking stick, even though he was, a teenager in most of these images, was because King Tut had a clubbed foot. Now, the reason he had so many genetic problems is because King Tut's parents, his mother and father, were actually brother and sister. Ugh. Um, Now, the reason that is because when you're a god living on Earth, you can't just have relationships with other mere, mortals. You have to, have relationships with people with similar kind of divine blood. And that's why King Tut's family tree didn't actually branch. So when we talk about these pharaohs, their power was highly centralized. Um, Whenever you're dealing with a ruler with divine power, especially one that is the embodiment of a god, that means that that ruler likely has absolute power. We can see that in the case of Egypt with the construction of their massive pyramids. So the pharaohs used both monumental architecture and art to legitimize their power. You can see this in the large sculptures that were built by pharaohs, these massive monumental pyramids. Actually the pharaoh on the right, one of the unique things about this particular pharaoh, that pharaoh's name is Hatshepsut, and what's unique about Hatshepsut was she was a female pharaoh, even though she wore a beard to legitimize her right to rule. Now, is this a similarity or difference to Mesopotamia? It really depends on what period of Mesopotamian history we're talking about. During the Sumerian period, where Mesopotamia were just these decentralized city states, that would be a difference. But over time, as Mesopotamia became more unified and became more centralized under, for instance, the Assyrians, that would be a similarity. We have these highly centralized, very powerful rulers in these civilizations. So the next big question we have to answer is, how were ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia similar socially, economically, and culturally? And then how were they different? So take a look at these items. These were all artifacts that were found in a tomb in Egypt dating to around 3600 BCE. Now, what conclusions can we draw about ancient Egypt from these particular artifacts? Now, the ones out of this set that stand out to me are the ones right here. Does anybody know what those are? Those are combs. Begs the question, why would someone be buried with so many combs? What function do combs serve in a society? And one of the functions, obviously, is for beauty. And whenever we're dealing with beauty, we may possibly then be talking about social status or standing. And so these would have been combs that were owned by someone of an upper class upbringing, and they suggest some craftsmanship. For instance, the one that with the hippo on it suggests that they were made by craftspeople. So we can draw some conclusions about Egyptian society. And when you study Egyptian society, some things that stand out is Egypt was a highly patriarchal society with very clearly defined social classes, and they also practiced slavery. So at the top of the Egyptian social pyramid was the pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. Below the pharaoh, you would have upper class royal family, government officials, soldiers. Below them, merchants, manufacturers, artisans made up kind of a middle class. And then you had the lower class, unskilled laborers and farmers. And at the very bottom of society, you would have slaves. So, is that a similarity or difference to Mesopotamia? I mean, we sort of look at the social structure, very similar, and also in terms of the patriarchal elements of their society, and also the way in which they practice slavery as a source of labor. So, in terms of their economic characteristics, ancient Egypt developed both regional trade with their neighbor to the south, the Nubians. They also developed long distance trans-regional trade with societies like the Mesopotamians. So here we can see an image showing the various trade networks. You can see Nubia, which was a society that was just below Egypt. They were constantly at war with one another, the Nubians and the Egyptians. It was located on the Nile River, a little further south. And then also you can see Mesopotamia on this map, and you can see those red lines showing the various trade networks, this web that was starting to form across Eurasia. Eventually, we're going to see it expanding over time, connecting societies like Mesopotamia and Egypt and Nubia together. So, in terms of ancient Egyptian religion, the ancient Egyptians were polytheists, meaning they worshiped many gods. And these gods were present in and in control of the various forces of nature. So they would have a god of the sun, a god of the Nile River, And those gods then would control those various aspects of the Egyptian environment. Now, the Egyptians had a strong belief in the afterlife, and one of the reasons we know this is from a source called the Book of the Dead, where they described a ceremony known as the Weighing of the Heart ceremony. And what was required in the weighing of the heart ceremony was for the soul of a dead person would descend into the afterlife. He'd be brought there by some of the various gods, where there would be a ceremony where his heart would be weighed against a feather, and the soul would have to engage in all kinds of confessions and say, I have not killed anyone, I have not stolen, I have not told any lies during my lifetime. And so this established essentially a moral code for Egyptians. They knew that in order for them to pass through successfully this ceremony, they had to live a moral life. And if they did, they would be eligible to go to heaven, or their version of heaven, which was known as the Fields of Hetep. So is this a similarity or difference to Mesopotamia? I think if you look carefully, you can find some both similarities and differences here. They were both polytheists, that would be a similarity. But in terms of the nature of their gods, the Egyptians were far more optimistic about the nature of their gods, and also their feelings toward the afterlife, whereas the Mesopotamians were far more pessimistic and viewed their gods as being sort of mean, moody, and random. Now, what can explain that difference? The major explanation for that difference is the fact that they have different geographies. So whereas Egypt's river, the Nile River, flooded regularly every year, and therefore the Egyptians had a very positive kind of outlook on their gods, the rivers in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, flooded unpredictably. So therefore, not surprisingly, the Mesopotamians viewed their gods with a little bit more skepticism or pessimism. Now, in terms of their writing systems, the ancient Egyptians developed their own writing system. It was right around the same time as the Mesopotamians developed their writing system, cuneiform. Now, the Egyptian writing system is known as hieroglyphs. It was a highly pictographic written language, and therefore the very first examples of this writing that we have are essentially pictures that were translated into words. Over time, it grew more complex. Now, for a long time, for thousands of years, historians couldn't translate hieroglyphics. It was essentially a dead, lost written language. Now, this all changed with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799. One of Napoleon's soldiers, when he was invading Egypt, discovered the Rosetta Stone, which is written in three languages: hieroglyphics at the top, the language that was unknown, an Egyptian demonic language in the middle, and then Greek at the bottom. And because Greek is translatable, and it was essentially saying the same thing, they were able to use the Rosetta Stone in order to translate hieroglyphics. Now, is this a similarity or difference to Mesopotamia? Well, this would be a similarity. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia developed the first systems of written language. They were initially started off as pictographic. They also served a very similar early purpose in that they were used primarily for accounting functions. Over time, as hieroglyphics and cuneiform evolved, so too did the purposes for which these two written language systems were utilized. Eventually, they would be utilized for things like writing down stories, for instance, in cuneiform, the Epic of Gilgamesh, in hieroglyphics, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. All right, so as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these big questions. How were the ancient Egyptians influenced by their environment? How did the ruler of ancient Egypt maintain political authority? How were the Egyptians and Mesopotamians similar socially, economically, and culturally? And in what ways were they different? As always, thanks for watching.